Angela Mariani, an old friend of mine, is here with me, and I'm happy to introduce her. She's done just about everything. She's a recording artist, a performer, a teacher, a broadcaster, and a performer on instruments that I can't even pronounce. In any case, here she is with me, and I'm very happy to see you. Hi, Angie. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks for
That's great.
having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's nice to see you. I've been a fan of your group Altramar for many years, but what I really like to know is how did you get to where you are, wherever that is? How did you get started in music, and how did you come to either discover or notice or get involved with what we now call early music? And back in the day, I don't know what we call it. Tell us about your own musical background.
Okay, sure. Well, I come from a family of musicians, very fortunate. Um, my dad was a jazz musician, and he was a musician from a young age, played in the Air Force band. My mom was a church musician, uh, she just had her 90th birthday. It's very exciting.
Wow.
But she's a church musician and sang in the church choir her whole life, and also was actually they met in marching band. My mom was playing the trumpet and he was a drummer. So, long history of being a musical family. My sister's a wonderful jazz singer. She's married to a wonderful jazz guitarist, and their son is a music teacher. So the whole family. Um, as far as early music, I was a rock and roll person
Huh.
before I came to early music. And I was also very interested in that thing that back in the 70s they used to call folk rock, where Fairport Convention and Steel Eye Span and all of these people who would take this old repertoire and kind of adjust it and play it sort of rock and roll style. And I loved that Pentangle and all of those groups. And, to be fair, I would have to say that that was probably one of the entry doors into early music, um, in terms of the fact that I'd be curious about that. Now, what is this thing that they just played? This old ballad. Um, and the funny thing is, I also, not to get too theoretical here, but I loved modal music, which a lot of folk music falls into that, and actually a lot of rock and roll too. I mean, Led Zeppelin, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so, and then I was in chorus in high school, and I was exposed to a lot of beautiful stuff. I distinctly remember doing something by Tomas Luis de Victoria and just flipping out over that, in high school. And then when I got to college, playing in rock bands the whole time, much to the dismay of my voice teachers, who were not pleased with that at all.
So you were a singer and a guitar player at the same time in those
Yeah,
days.
and a keyboardist.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And so I was doing all of that, and they wanted me to sing leader, and that was fine, but it wasn't the first thing I wanted to do, and they weren't happy. But somehow I got I remember auditioning for all these things, and they sort of threw me into the Collegium, which I had the feeling that that was kind of like, throwing you to the wolves or something, as far as all the opera singers thought. But anyway, they threw me in Collegium. And at that time, lutenist named Stan Sharkey
Oh,
was
I remember Stan. Yes.
he was directing the Collegium at UMass Amherst for that one semester. And we did, I think it was a Dufy mass, and I'm trying to remember which one it was now. It was a million years ago. But I just thought that was the most amazing thing that I'd ever heard in my life. And I got really turned on to this early music. Well, I think what happened at that time is I didn't really know the right people to help me kind of get on that path right away.
Uh-huh.
I was very happy to continue to be a rock and roller. Um, and Amherst early music hadn't started yet because I'm old. And,
We
you
all
know,
are. Tell me about it, but go on.
so, so I went off and was a freelance musician in Boston for 10 years. I played guitar. I taught guitar at a place called Guitar Workshop. I met my husband, Chris Smith, there. Um, and, was playing, again, this kind of fair, Fairport Convention style kind of stuff. We had a band called Renaudine that played that. And slowly I started to think, I was singing sort of with a couple of groups um, in a kind of just avocational way. And I said, I really think maybe my heart is here. Maybe this is what I want to do. And I started studying voice with Nancy Armstrong.
Yeah.
And then my husband got accepted into the jazz program at IU. We drove out to IU to look at the place.
IU, you mean Indiana University?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Indiana University, right. And we, so we went to look at the place, and I remember very vividly taking the elevator up to the third floor where Dave Baker's studio was. Chris went to talk to jazz great David Baker. And they had the whole display case for the Early Music Institute. And I remember walking out of the elevator and looking, and I said, Tom Binkley is here? I had no idea, but whatever. And my husband got accepted, into the program, and I ended up auditioning too. And they said, oh, I can't imagine what they were thinking. You'd have to ask Paul Elliott and Tom and Ava Lejeune that, because they listened to me and heard my tale about being a rock musician who wanted to go. Oh my gosh. But I suppose actually, if anybody would have accepted a rock musician who was keen to do this, it would have been Tom. So, and so that's how I really became completely entrenched in it, as I enrolled in the program at the Early Music Institute. And Tom Binkley, was an interesting character, but he could be a life changer, I'll tell you, when it came to inspiring you to go down a certain path.
Well, I guess that's true for lots of people. You operated there as a singer, essentially, is that right?
Yeah, I was a voice major. Yeah.
How did you come to start your group called Altramar?
Well, that, I'm almost wondering if I should run downstairs and get Jan Kosar, because she's here visiting me.
Well, give her my very, very best, but tell her the story.
Yeah. Well, I had started the original group that was sort of called that, was slightly different people. And then after that, it kind of reconfigured with Jan Kosar and myself, Chris Smith, David Stottleman, and Allison Zellis, now Allison Lloyd. That was the original lineup of Altramar. And then Allison was very involved with Bimbetta and also Theater of Voices and a lot of other groups. So the bulk of what we did recording wise was the four of us. And we recorded, oh gosh, 7 CDs maybe on the Dorian label. Mm-hmm. And sort of toured around and we're really, active during that decade.
So Altramar is what, an Occitan word for the land, sort of the land beyond the sea.
The land
beyond. Were you sort of thinking about inclusive cultural things? I mean, sort of looking beyond the traditional boundaries of high art Western culture, or where'd you come up with a name like that?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that. Where we came up with the name is kind of a funny story, because when the actual word Altramar, I'd heard Outremer, but I hadn't heard Altramar. And one semester at Indiana University, the medieval music scholar and performer Gerard Levaux was there giving he was doing a 1-year stint to replace somebody who was on sabbatical. And so he taught a seminar on troubadours. And at one point he talked about this term Altramar, which of course had to do with the Crusades and going across the Mediterranean, not the Atlantic. And I remember thinking to myself, well, isn't that wild? Because we're Americans and we're looking at all of this music that's really the music of Europe, let's face it, this European music. And in the margin of my notebook, I wrote Altramar dash great group name.
Uh-huh.
So that's where I got, this idea that we were actually Altramar. We were from across the sea, in this case, the Atlantic,
Mhm.
looking at all of this. And we did have a very strong interest in, we did a great big project on the, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim Spain uh, music from that culture, that combination of cultures. And so, yeah, we were very interested in things like that, and also things that were, I'm trying to think of how exactly to put this, not necessarily the main thread of what you read about. For example, we did a lot of research on medieval Irish and Celtic, the Celtic world,
Yeah.
all the way from Galicia, up through the insular countries and everything. And we were very interested in that too. Both Chris and I had a very strong love also for Irish traditional music, and that probably played into that.
A lot of it has to do with music that survives, what shall I say, sort of only in part or only as sort of suggestions for how the music ought to go. I'm starting with troubadour song where you have a melody, but there may be more to it than that, like an instrumental accompaniment or interludes. In other cases, you may have only lyrics or only certain ideas about how the music should go.
Mhm.
So there's a sense in which you're being scholarly on the one hand and completely off the wall creative on the other, to make these repertories come to life.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things that attracted me the most about it. Because yes, okay, we're playing medieval music, but we're playing new music, let's face it. We're and in a way, um there's this whole way in which for quite a long time we've been imagining the Middle Ages, right? And in many ways, there are many aspects of it that we know about, and here we have artifacts and so on. But there are other things that we frankly are coming at through our historical imagination.
Yeah.
I love that, Ben Bagby uses that phrase sometimes, historical imagination. I really like it. And that's really what we're doing, because we have some idea of what these instruments were. We have some idea of the modal construction of the scales and melodies in this. I don't want to get too much in the theoretical weeds, but we know that we have to create instrumental accompaniments. There's dozens of literary references to music making that talk about people being accompanied by instruments or playing instruments while they were singing or this and that, but nothing written in a score that tells us this is what they did.
Yeah.
And so that's fascinating. So we have to, now the difference between that and something like what a band like Fairport or Steel Eye or something would do with the rock stuff is that they're not attempting to make it sound the way it was then. It's not an intention. It's not part of their mission,
Right.
whatever.
Yes. Yeah.
They're making music now and they're saying, listen to this cool old ballad, and we're going to play it the way we do now in 19 whatever. It was 19 whatever at the time.
Yeah.
So that's different than saying, I really wonder what this sounded like. And I've got these instruments that I think are pretty close to these. And, it's an attempt at trying to, I don't like the word recreate, but even though I use it sometimes, but it's an attempt to sort of capture a sound or look through a window at, and say, what might this have sounded like? Which is a little bit different.
Yes. And on the good news and the bad news is that we'll never know how close we're coming.
Sure.
And we're always, of course, creating sounds that are pleasing to us, and we've no idea whether those sounds would be pleasing. So it's great. I mean, it's the challenge and the joy of doing it, is that you're always right and you're always wrong, I guess. So Angie, you've been dealing with this repertory, and I think you've been teaching this repertory for a long time. I know that you teach at Texas Tech, and you have for quite a long time run an early music ensemble there, right? I
Yes.
bet those are some lucky kids to get to have the pleasure and the challenge of working with you. Do you do a lot of that same Altramar repertory or similar work with your students at Texas Tech? What's it like?
Well, you know, I wouldn't say it doesn't necessarily duplicate Altramar's repertory, but I do probably more medieval music with them than the average university collegium musicum. I suspect. I don't, you know, I think one of the big differences between the Texas Tech Collegium and some of the others is that because of my own training, we're very heavily, I suppose you could say, weighted toward the earlier repertoire, whereas I would say probably now the vast majority of university collegia are concentrating on the Baroque,
Right.
you know, and classical repertoires.
Yeah.
Well, I don't play one of those instruments. And, you know, I'm not a conductor. And, you know, so we do a lot with the earlier things. I work with them to try to use some of these instruments. You know, what would you play if you were going to accompany this? Other times we'll do Renaissance repertoire. We have in the last few years been fabulous because we've had Bob Wimkin in working with some of our students with a loud band. And that's been really fun because I couldn't have done that in a million years. I mean, I can only get like strange goose noises out of the thing. So, you know, having Bob there has just been fabulous. You know, we were able to get these instruments. And then he comes and visits, you know, once or twice a semester and works with us.
Great. So you're a mixture of voices and instruments?
Yes.
Uh-huh. And
And
you sometimes together and sometimes apart. And I suppose it varies by semester or year or whatever.
it varies radically,
Yeah.
radically.
That's one of the hard things about being a collegium director, is having to come up with music for a group that you don't know what it's going to be yet.
That's right. You
Yeah.
never know who's going to show up. And, you know, I have to admit that sometimes I've sort of changed horses midstream. You know, I'll have this big plan in the summer. This is what we're going to do. And then an utterly different bunch of people show up
Yep.
than the previous year. And I think, well, okay, change, plan B. What was plan B again? I guess I have to make one. So yeah, you never know.
Well, I'm really glad that those of us who don't have the opportunity of being in the Texas Tech Collegium can learn a lot from your experience by looking at your very cool book about medieval music, which I have on my shelf and I can't find. But what's it called again?
It's called Improvisation and Invention in the Performance of Medieval Music.
That's it.
A
And
practical guide.
yeah. So what I really like about it is that it seems to me to be the fruit of long experience about the kinds of things that musicologists like me don't write about, because all we have is manuscripts. We have the documents and we have this note, and I have no idea what instrument accompanied it. But you talk about improvising an estampie and what the dance forms were like and what their vocal forms were like and how people made up things and how we might go about it. And you also, as I think, remember, you talk about it in a sort of, I don't want to say pedagogical way, but in the way you've learned to do by doing a step at a time. So it's not impossible. You just say, well, just try this and now try adding this to it and try adding that to it. And pretty soon you're actually making music maybe in the way that a medieval musician would make music, which I think is just great. It's a wonderful book.
Well, thanks. My intention in writing that, and there's kind of a long story behind that because it was also my doctoral document. But I went back and finished my doctorate after many years. So by that time, I kind of knew what I wanted to write, you know, and so conveniently became that as well. And then revised heavily, as we do, before it became a book. But, you know, in a way, that book was the book I wish I had when I was learning about early music at first, and medieval music at first. And how can I say this? I was the very grateful recipient of all that information, but not in a book, not in one place where I could see it all at the same time. I could not have written that book at all if I had never studied with Tom and Ben Bagby, Tom Binkley and Ben Bagby and Barbara Thornton.
Mhm.
Couldn't have written it. In a sense, I feel as though it was what I learned from them kind of, and also, some of the other faculty at the Early Music Institute who taught medieval music and occasionally, and filtered through my own experience
Right.
as
Yeah,
a
yeah. Mhm.
performer, and then as a performer who ends up being a teacher in a college situation, trying to convey what I know to other people. But that the font from which it came,
Yeah.
was essentially the oral teaching that I received.
Yeah.
Um, and so I always want to give credit where credit is due, because it would be nice if I had, thought up all of these ideas, but really I was lucky to have.
Well, but your book, in a way, is a document of one of the big changes that's happened in the early music field in the last 50 years, say, and that is that back in the day, people had to figure out how it might work.
Yeah.
And so you had the good fortune to be there at the beginning when people like Ben Bagby and Tom Binkley and other greats were
Mhm.
figuring it out and working with you and others to develop these things. And only after that is it, as you say, and after some experience, is it possible to write down, okay, here's a way to do it.
Yeah.
You can write it down in a book, and now we can go get Angie's book and get started, which was not possible then because everybody was figuring out things more or less for the first time.
Sure.
Now you can go to the Juilliard Early Music Program, or you can go to IU, or you can go to Texas Tech, and people will tell you how to do it. I
Mhm.
don't mean that they don't that they stifle your creativity, or that there isn't still an awful lot to be figured out, but it has changed. Wouldn't you agree?
I do. I'm very sorry a motorcycle decided to go by just as you were talking. And I hope that didn't mess up the Zoom recording. And
Well, we'll see. If it does, then just never mind what he was saying, and we're here to talk to Angie anyway. So
oh
whatever
my
he was
gosh.
saying doesn't matter.
Um,
Now, another thing that I want to bring up with you, because one of the things you're really good at is collecting and digesting information and making it available to a very much wider world. You have a radio program called Harmonia that's been a favorite of mine, although it's never been broadcast on a station where I live. I don't know why. It's partly because Boston is so snooty that they want only their own radio, I think. Um, but,
well,
but in
you
any
know,
case, tell
I
us
might
about,
say that it's because the Boston area has a lot to offer in
well, okay,
terms of
there's
early
a
music.
nice way
Yeah,
of putting it.
they have.
But tell us a little bit about Harmonia. How did it get started, and what have you been doing with it all this time?
Well, that's a long tale, and I'll try to make it not quite as long. But Harmonia came about when I was a announcer, board operator at WFIU in Bloomington in 1989. I started uh, working at WFIU, and I was just trying to put myself through graduate school. And it was a cool job. And I had when I was a kid, actually, I kind of wanted to be a DJ for a while. That was one of my big, when I was 12 or 13 years old. Of course, I wanted to be a rock and roll DJ. But so there I was in the radio station having a really good time. And our program director, Christina Kuzmich, came to me one day and she said, I know you're at the Early Music Institute, and you're doing these programs, and we're kind of wondering if you would be interested in developing an early music radio program. And I thought, wow, yeah, sure. I was very interested in that. And so we talked about it for a while. And she said, well, I said, I am a little concerned about finishing my degree. Sounds like a big job. And she said, well, go home and think about it. And okay, so I went straight to Tom Binkley. And I said, I've been given this opportunity to do this thing. They say that, you know, if it's a success, they might even syndicate it. So, but I'm kind of worried about, you know, doing my schoolwork and this. And Tom said, well, you should do it. You should just do it because you never know where it may lead. Never forget that. And, you know, I'll never forget that. So I said, okay, I'll do it. Of course, it took me quite a few years to finish my degree, but that's another story. So I started doing it, and another sort of funny story. So I was very excited. I wrote my first script, which was Hildegard, about Hildegard. I had two scripts that I started working on right away. One of them was Hildegard, and the other was Cantigas de Santa Maria. And so I gave the Hildegard script to Christina, and she was going to review it before I tried to record it or anything. And then I came back the next day, and she said, well, I'm not even going to try. She had a very beautiful sort of Ukrainian accent. I'm not even going to try to do it. But she said, this is a great musicology paper. Please go home and write a radio script and bring it back. And I said, okay, I get it. And actually, it took me a while to figure out how to do that because, and I'm just going to inject this because it's kind of a funny thing. I think people sometimes have the opposite problem now. A lot of students start to write scholarly papers, and they're so used to writing blog posts and Facebook posts and all of this that they're actually incredibly skilled at writing the way they speak.
Yes.
But they're not particularly skilled yet at writing scholarly prose. And what happens if you were an egghead like me and you read a bunch of stuff, you know, is you were good at writing the musicology paper, and you were good at talking, but not necessarily writing what you were saying when you were speaking. So I had to learn that. And I believe that it made me a much better lecturer and teacher later.
I'm sure that's true.
Because I was reaching out to people who didn't, let's face it, didn't know about, you know, this stuff, but I wanted to make it fun, and I wanted to make it approachable, and I wanted to make it attractive to history nuts and, you know, this kind of thing. And that really, doing the radio program really helped me to be able to communicate with students about this stuff as well.
Wow, and you communicated with a lot of people in the world. Harmonia has been going for what, 30 years now,
About
did you
30
say?
years. Yeah, for the first, oh gosh, I don't know how many years, I did almost everything. You know, I did all the interviews, and I edited a lot. I edited the interviews, and I had a couple of fantastic engineers that helped me. And you know, Michael Pashkash from WFIU has been engineering the show for, you know, decades, and he's just wonderful. Um, and what happened was then you know, time went by and I started teaching. I was given a full-time appointment at Tech. Collegium at first was part-time, and then it sort of grew, and I ended up with a full-time teaching appointment. And I said to them, I can't do this. I'm trying to do this, and I'm up till 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm running myself ragged. I can't do it anymore. And we came to an agreement that they would form a team. So instead of just being me, it was a production team. So we have, you know, producers and writers and editors, and, you know, and we have a small team. And you know, folks like, well, Wendy Gillespie's been doing quite a bit with it in recent years, and Luann Johnson, who's been a fabulous production assistant for many years. So we really have sort of built something, and we've had a whole. I'm not even going to start listing the writers because I would be here for the next 15 minutes. We've had people contribute scripts to the show, and it's just been a wonderful project. So I kind of think of myself now. I still host it, of course, and I do a lot of, you know, editing and stuff. And I think of myself a little bit like the general editor of a journal that you sort of looks at everything, and you know. So I really am very grateful for WFIU's support of the show for all these years, and yeah, it's still going.
Well, a lot of us are grateful for its existence for all these years. And of course, you've no way of knowing how many people you may have touched or inspired or gotten going in early music by listening to this crazy music and crazy talk over the radio for the last 30 years. But you've kind of invented a whole series of careers. One of the interesting things about the early music world is how much it's changed. I mean, the whole music world is changing now, partly because of the change in recording technology and economics and all sorts of other things. But how do you see, what do you see for the future of our movement or repertory or whatever it is? If you have any parting words for people watching and who are going to be concerned about not just the last 50 years, but the next 50 years, you've really invented a large part of the early music history that we all have lived. What do you predict for the future, Angie?
Well, I can say that. I will say that, I'm not really sure, how much I've invented. I know when I was speaking to you before, I said I feel a little bit like I've happily run down trails that other people have blazed. But as far as the future goes, you know, I think I'm going to stick to medieval music because I'm not sure where a lot of it's going.
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
Um, there's a few things that are really interesting. Well, the field of medieval studies is absolutely fascinating right now because there's all kinds of inquiry um, about different sorts of well, first of all, inclusivity issues within the field, but also being a little bit more aggressive about exploring some of the diversity in medieval studies, in its repertoire, in the musical repertoire, and a lot of things. So
Yes.
there's a lot of good things going on there. As far as what's going to happen to the scene, um, I'll get on I'm going to start playing my tiny violin about something that I always
Feel free. Feel free.
um, I really think that medieval music, the field of medieval music, suffered from from the fact that we tended to promote it in the same way that we promoted Baroque music and this kind of thing, and it has a different audience. I really believe it has a different audience. The biggest audiences that we got, if I had to think back on numbers of bodies, for Altramar programs, concerts, were the couple of times that we played for world music or folk music festivals.
Yes.
Big audiences. The exception to that was Regensburg, but that's a whole other thing
Yeah, yeah.
because
Right.
people are there for the early music. But I mean, so that says something. And I still believe that one of the problems, and it happens with radio too, one of the problems is that you're trying to sell this music to the same people who, listen to the Met Opera broadcasts or that listen to, the Baroque music programs, and you're not trying to sell it to the people who listen to Thistle and Shamrock. And those are the people who are going to really love a lot of this medieval music stuff.
Right.
So part of it, I think, is I'm hoping that we find a way to be able to reach that audience. And I think that podcasts are going to be really important
Mm-hmm.
for that. And I think that, podcasting will then be superseded by something else in
Sure.
5 or 8 years or whatever. But right now, I think that would be a really fruitful way for us to reach out. Um, in terms of, there's another thing that we have to do, and here comes the tiny violin again. In early music and especially in medieval music is, there's a lot of people out there who, life stopped when Game of Thrones was on Sundays or whatever it was. And there's a lot of people who are fascinated in this idea of imagining the Middle Ages,
Yeah.
or in, you know, um, engaging with these earlier times. They would love medieval music. And I think that we have to, and I say this as a radio person, broadcasting to a general audience, you've got to be aware of the general audience. And it's very nice when people understand what you're doing and, they have that kind of cognoscenti, but everybody, it's available to everybody. And I think that that's something that we might want to think about and seek out a little bit more. And the other thing is that medieval music being, you know, allied with medieval studies, there's some strange stuff going on with medieval studies and people, how can I say this? People who are sort of claiming that as their own, who have a political agenda. Maybe that's what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
And we need to be a little careful about that.
Well, you've set a lot of tasks for the future, but I think you're right. The idea that we need to not be so protective and inward looking, look out and say, come on in. We've got some great stuff that you're going to like. And it's not necessarily the Metropolitan Opera people who are going to like it the best. Well, I don't know. I hope that all your optimistic predictions for the future come true, Angie. You've certainly made a huge contribution in the past and in the present to where we are and to where we're going. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to talk to you. So I don't know if you have any parting words for the present and the future. If not, I'll just say what a pleasure it is to have this chance to chat with you again. And I look forward to many times in the future. So thank you very much, Angela Mariani.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure, Tom.
Thanks.